This is a sad story. I was in the room when my dad died on a Sunday afternoon, a little after lunchtime. He had lived, if you could call it that, for many years in a nursing home. Like a lot of modern people, my dad died very, very, very slowly. He had dementia. For perhaps a decade, he had been in a slow decline. For the last 2 years, he was unable to recognize me or anybody else. He became stone deaf. His eyesight failed. For years, he was incontinent. He was so ill at Christmas that we all thought he would die, but he managed to recover. He never spoke a word to anyone, just lay there in the bed. Occasionally he made noises. He occasionally gestured. I arrived in his room when he was nearing the end. He was attended by a nurse and her aide. My mother was weeping helplessly nearby. She had been weeping for hours, weeping nonstop since hearing the news that my dad was dying. The nursing home is not in my town, so it took me a while, an hour and a half to get there. But my mom was only minutes away. Her pastor drove her, and she sat beside my dad's bed for hours. That whole time she wept. By the time I arrived, there were huge red circles around her eyes. In a way, I felt as if I had suddenly entered a theater and was watching a play. My father was giving a performance so profoundly tragic that I could not turn away my eyes, except it was not clear if my father was the only actor. It felt like we were all in a play. We were all on stage. It was the most intimate kind of theater. The actors and the audience could reach out and touch one another. The little room was crowded, standing room only. We were all confused by our roles. There is a famous actor's nightmare. Everyone is staring at you and you have no idea what to do. You can't remember your lines. It was exactly like that. I was terrified of my father. He seemed completely blind. I remember years ago he came back from visiting the deathbed of his mother-in-law, and he told me that her eyes had glazed at the end, and this was certainly true of my father. His eyelids were partially closed, but his eyes were glazed. There was an almost milky cast to them. I am sure he was not looking out at any of us. I doubt he was aware any of us were in the room. He was full of morphine. That's how we die now, full of morphine. He was breathing, but it was a very strange sort of breathing, shallow and loud, like a rattle. It hardly seemed human. I kept thinking that each breath was his last. Each breath would shudder to an end and his mouth would gape. And then suddenly he would abruptly gasp again, like a fish dying on dry land. There is something awful, awe-inspiring, and primitive about dying. I was speechless the moment I walked into that little room and saw my father. I was afraid to touch him, but one of my nieces crawled into the bed and embraced him. One thing about my dad, all his granddaughters adored him. My mother stroked one of my father's hands. It hung limp at his side, dangling over the edge of the bed. She told me that just before I had come, he had raised both hands into the air. Mom interpreted that gesture, which sounded like a startled response, like the startled response of a newborn baby. She interpreted it as a gesture to God. He was saying, "Here I am, God." My mother imitated that gesture, and she explained it to every new person who came into the room. I'm pretty sure her pastor made all that up. It's the kind of thing that pastors like to tell people. I do not have any faith in an afterlife. I believed I was watching the very end of my dad's life. Really, most of what I loved the best about him had been dead for a long time. I felt as if I was visiting his remains. Somehow they were alive, just barely. My mother stood, though she was very frail and wobbly, and I held her, and my sister gripped her free hand, and we watched my father die. Finally, the breaths came at ever more distant intervals, and finally, there were no more. It was over. The nurse attached a blood pressure device, and we watched its digital numbers drop steadily to 0. My mom and sister and I hugged one another. We were all afraid to approach the body. The nurse's eyes were full of tears, and so I loved her. She gently touched my father, and so I loved her for that too. She had known my father for several years. She had never known him in his prime. But even in his deep old age, she had found things in him to love, and she grieved his passing. Her aide told me that it was her day off, but when she had heard my father was dying, she had come to be with him. I loved her. I loved anyone who ever loved my father, but especially those strangers who loved him at the end when he had so little left. In his prime, my father was a kind, quiet, decent man. He loved God and country and family and never got very complicated. Bless his heart.